as we look at the rest of the Torah, we're going to see that it's a mix of narrative and law, two different types of genre. The law is interspersed in the middle of the story that is about freedom, the freedom that God has called his people to, and the freedom that he bought for them out of Egypt. So just a quick recap on how we got here. God created the garden as he intended the world to be, but sin was tearing God's good world apart. We saw that he chose Abraham's family to bless so that they could be a blessing and be his image bearers to the rest of the world. But this family is rather dysfunctional. We see that through Isaac and Jacob and his sons who end up in Egypt. Now, in Egypt, when living there, when they first got there, they were given some of the best land in Egypt, and things were pretty good. But 400 years later arises a different kind of Pharaoh who doesn't remember Joseph. And as the Hebrew people have grown to be numerous, he decides to enslave them and oppress them. And at the end of the day, he issues an edict that every Hebrew boy be killed. And I want to slow down here for a second and unpack that for you. Why every Hebrew boy be killed? Well, some of the best land was given to the Hebrews by the Pharaoh that loved Joseph. And property gets passed down amongst men. Women don't own property at this time. And so if all of the Hebrew boys were killed, who would the Hebrew girls grow up to marry? Well, either they'd die off as a people or they'd have to marry the Egyptian boys. And therefore, all the property would end up passing back to the Egyptians. So this wasn't just a minor genocide of sorts, but also a plan to strip these people of everything that they had. So consider that when you look at the full story, that God is going to redeem and rescue these people out of Egypt and bring them to the promised land, a land that he himself will give them. Wow. So this is called freedom because that is where we see that word, redemption and salvation, for the first time. And this is what God intends to purchase for them and bring them into the promised land. But their rebellion and their lack of trust in God means that they don't even trust that he will. Even though they've seen him lead them out of Egypt with a mighty arm and outstretched hand, the spies in Numbers chapter 17, which you read, they doubt who God says he is and what he says they will do. And the people believe them and wander for another 40 years. But God is faithful. He still brings them into the promised land. And the book of Numbers ends with chapters 22 through 24. Even another king wants to oppress the people of Israel. And so King Balak calls the prophet Balaam and says, curse these people. And Balaam says, I can only say what the Lord tells me to say of them. And God still chooses to bless them, even though they have been a people with a rebellious heart. So there's a couple things I want to take a deeper dive on with you here. First, the 10 plagues, and then the law that brings freedom. So first, the 10 plagues. First, these plagues are an act of divine judgment against oppression. And so what does that say about God? Pharaoh is their oppressor, but he is going to judge that oppressor. And it tells me that God cares and he's going to do something about this. And if I'm to be an image bearer, then may I also care about oppression in the world around me, knowing that he will make everything right in the end. Second, this initial request by Moses to Pharaoh was just to go out into the desert for 3 days to worship. So why? Why that? Well, Moses said it's going to be repulsive to the Egyptians. What would be repulsive? Well, God said, I want you to sacrifice cattle, goats, and rams. And these are the animals that the Egyptians worshipped. So yeah, it would be offensive. That's why they needed to get out in the middle of the desert away from them. But why would God ask them to do such a thing as an act of worship? Well, they'd been living among the Egyptians for so long, and these were their gods. God didn't want to just purchase their physical freedom, but also freedom for their minds and their hearts. They had grown addicted to the Egyptians' gods as they've embraced their culture, and they needed to lay it down. And so how about us? Does God want more than just our physical freedom? Does he desire freedom for our minds and our hearts? And what might we have to lay on the altar that we have worshipped as a false god? So were these plagues natural occurrences? Well, there's some argument that they were, and they could have been. But also let us understand that they are an indictment on the gods of Egypt. So let me walk you through that. Well, first, red tide could have happened with the Nile, causing it all of its trouble. And, well, that's pretty good because they also worship the Nile. So that would have led to all the fish dying, which then also could have led to the swelling of population of frogs. Of course, as all this death occurs with standing water, then we have a breeding ground for gnats and flies, other plagues. And of course, these insects then could carry disease, which then could disease all the livestock. Boils also could come from these flies. And then hail and locusts are pretty common in this area of the world. Lastly, darkness that lasts for 3 days. There are sandstorms that can blow enough stands through the air that it could blacken out the sun for a time, which also was an indictment on the sun god that they worshipped, as well as I mentioned the livestock they worship. So there's a ton of indictment happening on the gods of Egypt and what they call deer. But in the middle of it all, God provides escape and provision, even for the Egyptians. In Exodus chapter 9, there's a warning about the hailstorm, and so people could bring their livestock in to protect them. Also, not all of the crops had come in, and so not everything was destroyed. But the final plague, the plague of the firstborn, there's not really a natural occurrence explanation for this one. But let me explain about the concept of the firstborn. In many of these cultures in this time, the firstborn got the double portion of the inheritance. They also got the birthright. So the Hebrew people, the Israelites, they were intended to be the firstborn of God the Father amongst all the people. They get the double portion of the blessing, as well as are there to represent the Father's intentions to the rest of the children. Well, specifically for Pharaoh, he himself was also considered divine, so his firstborn is also divine. So here's an indictment on that. But there's still protection and provision, even for this plague. It's called the Passover. And I'll unpack more of that later, but for now, it is a sacrifice followed by a ritual meal. Don't you hear the concept of covenant there? A sacrifice followed by a meal together. And it is a foreshadowing of that will be required for redemption throughout the rest of the pages of the Bible. It's a foreshadowing of the sacrificial system, as well as the redemption that Jesus will purchase for us on the cross. So second, the law that brings freedom. These Israelites, they had grown up in slavery, and so this was their mindset. The law's intent was to rewrite and reauthor how they think about life, to reauthor their relationship with God and their relationships with others. How should we treat other people? That's a new concept when you've grown up in slavery. When we think of the law, we often immediately think of the 10 Commandments, and that's in Exodus chapter 20, if you want to turn there now. The beginning of that chapter says, I am the Lord your God who brought you out of Egypt, therefore, and then goes into the 10 Commandments. Talking with a rabbi friend of mine once, I said, yeah, it's the preamble to the 10 Commandments, and he said, no, it's part of them. It's like God is saying, once you were slaves, but now you're free, and this is how you stay free. It's very much so a part of the command. Hey, stay free. So can you imagine a world where we did love God first and most and didn't worship other gods, where we didn't lie, cheat, and steal? Man, what a free world would that be? I'd love to live there. The law brings freedom. There's other books of the law too. Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy round out these first 5 books, the Pentateuch or the Torah. And Leviticus, so a quick word on each of them. Leviticus establishes that we must approach God through sacrifices and by a mediator. The Levites were the priests. They were the mediators that did the sacrifices for the people. You read about the Day of Atonement and a chapter of laws on provisions for the foreigners. Well, the Day of Atonement foreshadows what Jesus will do for us. And the laws to protect foreigners, don't you hear Exodus 20 in there also? You once were slaves, now you're free. Well, you once were foreigners. Here's how you take care of the foreigners that live among you. Remember where you came from. Remember how I took care of you. So don't plow to the edge of your field, but leave something for them. That's how they are to be image bearers and live out the covenant, telling the rest of the world who God is and what he's like. See, he's not looking for perfect behavior. If he were, then this whole sacrificial system that's set up in these books is kind of a moot point and pointless. He's not looking for that perfect behavior. He's looking for devotion. And he's showing us what devotion looks like. That's what the laws are. So it's not about these rules and rights and behavior, but rather it is about relationship. And so that's what we need to have in mind as we read the rest of the Torah, that we are looking for these covenant moments. So now Numbers kind of unpacks God's covenant loyalty towards his people, even when they keep rebelling, and walks us up through him preparing them to enter the promised land themselves. You read about the spies in chapter 13, and how they, as leaders of the tribes, made everybody doubt God's character and his provision, that he would do what he said he would do. Man, isn't leadership important? And whatever we are leading, whatever God has entrusted to us, can we help those people remember who they are and whose they are, and lead them to trust God and his character? Because he will let you die in the wilderness if you want to. They wandered for 40 more years because of this. And that allowed an entire generation that left Egypt, that was rescued by him, to die off and never actually enter the promised land. He'll let us. Deuteronomy's key word is remember. It's a series of speeches that Moses gives, basically saying, hey, remember how God led you out of Egypt? And remember how your parents didn't quite get it? Don't squander your opportunities too. And it ends with Moses getting to see what he doesn't actually get to go into, though. So this is a story of how to not keep making the same stupid mistakes. Hey, remember so that you can do things differently when you get in there. And so you read those last couple chapters where Moses is preparing them to enter the promised land. You also read the Shema in chapter 6. And this is something that has been repeated across the years by Jewish people and Christians alike now, much like how we might recite the Nicene Creed. Hear, O Israel, the Lord your God is one. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. This is a guiding principle we see throughout Scripture. And so let's explore then how this freedom fits into the one overarching story. Well, first, these 5 books, the Pentateuch, the Torah, they're all attributed to Moses. Why did he write them? Well, not just to keep their history and their law, but also he had walked with these people that were once slaves and now were free, and he needed to help them know who they were. They needed to know their story. They need to know who they are and whose they are. So likewise, may we go from I've got to earn it myself, a slave and poverty mentality, to one who says, I am a child of the covenant-keeping, relational Yahweh God, who is also all-powerful Elohim, and he will fight for me. The concept of his presence is something that we see here in freedom as well as through the rest of the story. In Exodus chapter 3, if you want to turn there and follow along, we see in verses 7 through 10 that God basically says, I see, I've heard, I know what my people are going through, and so I'm going to do something about it. And so he says, I'm sending you, Moses. His presence, he desires so badly to be with his people. And then he's going to go with Moses as well. Well, Moses doesn't quite grasp this at first. We see in verses 11 and 13, Moses basically asks, well, who am I? And who should I say sent me? And maybe we're like Moses sometimes. God is calling us to do something big, and we get freaked out and say, who am I? Why should I do this? And we come with our yeah buts, but I'm not a good speaker. And God says to Moses, but who made your mouth? What if they don't believe me? I'll give you signs, Moses. Moses is saying, who am I, and who should I say sent me? Basically, if I'm going to put my life on the line, I need to know who's sending me and who's going with me. And so God answers that question by naming himself. And that's in verse 14 and 15. He says, I am has sent you. And that's the same thing that Jesus does in the book of John. Theologians call them the I am statements of Jesus. He says, I am the bread of life. I am the good shepherd. I am the way, the truth, and the life. He is naming himself much like how God named himself here in front of Moses. And this is the first time that God names himself. To this point, people had been naming God. Wow. So his presence is his character. He is the I am God that will go with me. And then lastly, the tabernacle. This is the dwelling place of God. And it is a shout out back to the Garden of Eden in its design and the interior. It's also a foreshadow of what we see, the reconstruction of the new heaven and the new earth in Revelation. And then in the New Testament, it says that the Word became flesh in the book of John and tabernacled among us, speaking of Jesus. He is Emmanuel, God with us. And then our bodies are the temple of the Holy Spirit, as Paul writes. Man, his presence is with us and among us. As the psalmist has written in Psalm 139, where can I go from your presence? Where can I flee from your spirit? It says, you go before me and behind me. You've placed your hand on my head. His presence is throughout Scripture. Then Passover. I said I would unpack it some more. They put blood on the doorposts above and on the sides. And if you grew up in a church that does the sign of the cross, you see what I just did there. It is a foreshadowing of what Jesus would fulfill. This Passover was where justice was served by a substitution of a lamb. And that is what occurs in the sacrificial system in the Old Testament and what Jesus accomplishes on the cross. Justice is meted out on Christ on the cross as he is the substitution for us. And this Passover becomes a feast, one of three major feasts that Jewish people have celebrated ever since. If you get the chance ever to celebrate Passover with a Jewish family, do it. The Bible will come alive for you in ways you can't even imagine. And this Passover feast is what Jesus was celebrating with his disciples on the night he was betrayed. And this is what we celebrate as Christians in the Eucharist and in communion. Jesus came to fulfill that law that I was just talking about. In the Shema, Jesus quoted the Shema when he was asked what law is most important. And he said, it's the first and second commandment, that everything is wrapped up in this. Can we love God first and most, and can we love our neighbor as ourselves? But we can't. I don't know about you, but I do not love God with all my heart, soul, mind, and strength. I don't. I can't. And I definitely don't love my neighbor as myself. Some days I don't love myself. And Jesus calls us not to just do that, but even love our enemies. Man, then that's what he came to live out, to show us what it looked like. And he loved everyone, even his enemies, even to the point of death. So may we, by the grace of God, have his Spirit put inside of us so that we may be image bearers and live in that covenant with the covenant-keeping God. That we would receive the love he has given us, that we could then begin to love God back, first and most. That we would see ourselves the way he sees us in that reception of love, so that we can love ourselves and then have a chance to love our neighbor as we love ourselves. And by God's grace, receive his forgiveness so that we then in turn can pass that forgiveness even to our enemies. This is how we will live as a covenant family member of God, being image bearers and showing the freedom that he wants to bring to a watching world.